The date is July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong's boot touches the lunar surface and humanity holds its breath. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Whoa! The words echo across a world united in wonder, watching grainy footage of our species' greatest triumph. But what if I told you that this moment, this pinnacle of human achievement, wasn't about reaching the moon at all? What if it was about making sure you never looked too closely at what was already waiting there? Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. Your mission control, Houston, 1969. You've got the most powerful telescopes on Earth, surveillance technology that can read a license plate from orbit, and the brightest minds in aerospace engineering. You've been watching the moon for decades through instruments the public has never seen. And then, one day, you spot something that changes everything, something that makes your blood run cold, something so significant that you realize humanity isn't ready to know about it. Not yet, maybe not ever. So, what do? You can't uninvent the telescope. You can't stop other nations from developing their own lunar observation programs. You can't prevent amateur astronomers from getting better equipment each year. The secret is going to come out eventually, unless you control the narrative, unless you get there first and make sure that when the world looks at the moon, they see exactly what you want them to see. Welcome to the most explosive investigation you've never heard of, where we're going to unravel a conspiracy so vast, so intricate, that it makes every other cover-up look like child's play. I'm your host, and for the next hour, we're going to dive into evidence that suggests the Apollo missions weren't about exploration or national pride. They were about concealment, about making sure that when humanity finally set foot on our celestial neighbor, we found exactly what we were supposed to find. Nothing more, nothing less. But here's where this gets absolutely mind-bending. I've spent the last 3 years researching this story, diving into declassified documents, interviewing former NASA engineers who were willing to speak off the record, and analyzing photographic evidence that the mainstream media refuses to touch. What I've uncovered isn't just a theory, it's a paper trail of deliberate misdirection that goes all the way to the top of the United States government and involves technologies that officially don't exist. The evidence I'm about to show you comes from multiple independent sources. Former Soviet space program officials who've broken their decades of silence. Retired American astronauts whose testimonies were sealed for 50 years. Photographic analysts who've spent their careers examining lunar imagery and found anomalies that defy explanation. And perhaps most disturbing of all, recently leaked internal communications from NASA that suggest the agency knew far more about lunar conditions than they ever publicly admitted. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't about whether humans actually went to the moon. The evidence is overwhelming that we did, multiple times, with incredible precision and at enormous cost. But that raises an even more disturbing question. If we really did go to the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, and if the technology was so successful, and if the scientific discoveries were so valuable, then why did we suddenly stop? Why did the most powerful nation on Earth, fresh off the greatest technological achievement in human history, suddenly lose all interest in returning? The official answer is budget constraints and shifting political priorities. But when you look at the actual numbers, when you examine what NASA was requesting versus what Congress was willing to fund, the math doesn't add up. The Apollo program was expensive, yes, but it was also generating technologies that were revolutionizing everything from computing to materials science. The return on investment was astronomical, if you'll pardon the pun. So why the sudden shutdown? Here's where things start to get really interesting. In 1973, just 1 year after the final Apollo mission, NASA's budget for lunar research didn't just decrease, it was virtually eliminated. But here's the kicker. Their budget for what they called deep space monitoring increased by 340%. They weren't losing interest in space, They were shifting their focus from going there to watching it, from exploration to surveillance. And it wasn't just NASA. In the same time frame, the Soviet Union, which had been in a desperate race to reach the moon, suddenly announced they had never been interested in lunar exploration at all. They claimed their focus had always been on orbital stations and Mars exploration. But internal documents that have surfaced since the fall of the Soviet Union tell a very different story. They reveal a program called Luna Obscura that was specifically designed to monitor what they called anomalous lunar phenomena, not to land on the moon, but to watch it, to document changes, to track what they described as non-terrestrial engineering signatures. Let me paint you a picture of what the moon looked like to astronomers before 1969. For centuries, observers had been documenting what they called lunar transient phenomena, flashes of light on the dark side of the moon, geometric patterns that appeared and disappeared in specific crater formations, structures that seemed to move or change position over time. The official explanation was always the same: optical illusions, atmospheric distortion, equipment malfunction. But in 1966, NASA published a report called Chronological Catalogue of Reported Lunar Events that documented over 500 instances of unexplained lunar phenomena dating back to 1540. 500 documented cases of things happening on the moon that couldn't be explained by conventional geology or physics. The report was 60 pages long and included detailed maps showing where these events occurred most frequently. And then, mysteriously, after 1969, reports of lunar transient phenomena dropped to almost zero. Think about that for a moment. For over 400 years, trained astronomers around the world were regularly observing and documenting unexplained activities on the lunar surface. Then, coincidentally, right after humans land on the moon for the first time, these phenomena suddenly stopped being reported. Either the moon became completely inactive the moment we arrived, or something else was happening. Something that required a very different kind of explanation. This is where our investigation takes a darker turn, because what I'm about to show you suggests that the Apollo missions weren't just about planting a flag and collecting rocks. They were about establishing a presence, about setting up infrastructure, about making sure that when other nations developed the technology to reach the moon, they would find an American installation already there, ready to control what could and couldn't be observed. The evidence starts with the astronauts themselves. In post-mission debriefings that were classified for decades, several Apollo crew members reported seeing structures on the lunar surface that weren't included in their pre-flight briefings. Not natural formations, but geometric constructions that appeared to be artificial. When they requested permission to investigate these anomalies, they were told to focus on their primary mission objectives and that specialized teams would handle follow-up observations. But here's what's really disturbing. Those specialized teams were never NASA employees. According to documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, the personnel who handled anomalous lunar observations were on loan from a joint Pentagon-CIA program called Project Lunar Shield. Their job was to evaluate, catalog, and determine the appropriate response to anything found on the moon that didn't fit conventional understanding. The paper trail for Project Lunar Shield is fragmentary, but what exists is explosive. Budget allocations that don't match any publicly acknowledged NASA programs. Personnel assignments that involve individuals with backgrounds in archaeology, xenobiology, and what's described as non-terrestrial engineering analysis. Equipment requisitions for technologies that officially didn't exist in 1969, including ground-penetrating radar systems capable of mapping subsurface structures to a depth of several kilometers. Most telling of all are the mission modifications. Every Apollo landing after the first included what NASA called extended geological surveys. But when you examine the actual routes taken by the lunar rovers and the specific locations where samples were collected, they don't match standard geological survey patterns. Instead, They form precise geometric shapes around specific crater formations. The astronauts weren't just exploring randomly, they were investigating predetermined targets. And those targets weren't chosen by NASA's geology team. According to internal communications that have recently surfaced, the landing site selections for Apollo missions 12 through 17 were influenced by what's described as prior observational data indicating artificial modifications to natural lunar features. Someone somewhere had been watching the moon long enough and carefully enough to identify specific locations that warranted investigation. But here's where this conspiracy reaches truly staggering proportions. The modifications to the Apollo spacecraft for later missions included equipment that was never publicly acknowledged. High-resolution imaging systems capable of detecting structures buried beneath the lunar surface. Seismic monitoring equipment designed to identify hollow spaces and artificial cavities. And most mysteriously, what's described in technical documents as containment and transport protocols for non-terrestrial artifacts. The astronauts weren't just explorers. They were also, whether they knew it or not, an advanced team for a cover-up operation that had been planned from the very beginning. Their job was to establish an American presence on the moon before anyone else could get there and discover what was already waiting. And what was waiting there? That's where our investigation leads us into territory that challenges everything we think we know about human history, about our place in the universe, and about the lengths to which powerful institutions will go to control information that could fundamentally change how we see ourselves. The clues are hidden in plain sight, scattered across decades of classified documents, buried in technical specifications, and encoded in the very structure of the space program itself. But when you piece them together, when you follow the money and the personnel assignments and the sudden shifts in research priorities, a picture emerges that's so shocking, so paradigm-shifting, that it makes you understand why it had to be concealed. Because what if the moon landing wasn't humanity's first step into space? What if it was our second? What if something had been there long before we arrived, waiting in the shadows of craters that never see sunlight, hidden in structures that predate human civilization by millennia? The evidence is overwhelming, and it's been hiding in government archives for over 50 years. Documents that were supposed to remain classified forever have been released through bureaucratic oversight. Former NASA employees who signed lifetime non-disclosure agreements are reaching the end of their lives and deciding that the truth is more important than their legal obligations. And photographic evidence that was dismissed as optical illusions or equipment malfunctions is being reanalyzed with modern digital enhancement techniques that reveal details the original investigators never could have seen. What emerges from this evidence isn't just a story about space exploration. It's a story about humanity's place in a universe that's far stranger and more populated than we've been allowed to believe. It's about technologies that existed before humans developed agriculture, about civilizations that built structures while our ancestors were still learning to make fire, and about a cover-up so sophisticated that it turned humanity's greatest achievement into its most successful deception. But most importantly, it's about what's still there, waiting on the moon, protected by international treaties that prevent anyone except a few select organizations from investigating certain lunar regions. Waiting for us to develop the courage to look closely at what we've been told is empty space and see what's actually been hiding there all along. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you can possibly imagine, and what we uncover next will make you question everything you thought you knew about human history and our place in the cosmos. Let's start with the photographs. Not the famous ones you've seen in textbooks, but the ones that were taken and then quietly removed from public archives. In 1994, a former NASA photographic analyst named Dr. Patricia Williams was cleaning out her office after retirement when she discovered a mislabeled file containing what she initially thought were test shots from the Apollo 16 mission. But when she examined them more closely, she realized these weren't test shots at all. They were the original unenhanced images from the lunar surface, taken before they went through what NASA called standard photographic processing. Dr. Williams had spent 30 years analyzing lunar photographs, so she knew immediately that something was wrong. The processed versions that had been released to the public were missing crucial details that appeared clearly in the originals. Geometric shapes in crater walls that had been digitally smoothed out. Reflective surfaces that had been darkened or removed entirely. And most disturbing of all, what appeared to be structural elements that cast shadows inconsistent with natural rock formations. When Dr. Williams attempted to bring these discrepancies to her supervisor's attention, she was told that the original photographs had been damaged during storage, and that the processed versions were actually more accurate representations of what the astronauts had seen. But Dr. Williams had been working with photographic analysis long enough to know the difference between storage damage and deliberate alteration. These images hadn't been damaged. They'd been edited. Here's where things get really interesting. Dr. Williams wasn't the only one who noticed these discrepancies. Between 1995 and 2003, at least 7 other former NASA employees came forward with similar stories. Photographic technicians, mission specialists, even a few astronauts who had been sworn to secrecy for decades. They all described the same pattern: original data that showed anomalies, followed by processed versions that had been sanitized for public release. But the most explosive testimony came from someone you've probably never heard of: Commander Sarah Chen, who served as a communications specialist during the Apollo 15 mission. For 40 years, she kept quiet about what she heard in the radio transmissions between the lunar module and mission control. Conversations that were never included in the official transcripts. Communications that were immediately classified under what's called a national security override. According to Commander Chen, during the second day of the Apollo 15 surface operations, the astronauts reported discovering what they described as artificial structures approximately 2 kilometers from their landing site. Not rocks or natural formations, but constructed elements that appeared to be partially buried beneath lunar regolith. The conversation that followed, according to Chen, involved immediate instructions to cease investigation and return to predetermined mission parameters. But here's what makes Chen's testimony so credible. She kept copies. Against direct orders and at enormous personal risk, she recorded backup copies of these communications on personal equipment. When she finally decided to come forward in 2009, she brought with her over 14 hours of previously unreleased audio from the Apollo missions. Audio that reveals a very different story than the one we've been told. In these recordings, you can hear the excitement in the astronauts' voices when they first spot the anomalies. You can hear their confusion when they're told to ignore what they're seeing. And most chilling of all, you can hear the moment when they realize that their mission briefings had been deliberately incomplete. They weren't just explorers, they were participants in a carefully orchestrated information control operation. The audio quality is poor, and much of the technical discussion is hard to follow, but certain phrases come through clearly. Houston, we're seeing geometric patterns that don't match our geological surveys. Repeat, these structures appear to be artificial in origin. Request permission to investigate the metallic reflections in grid sector 7. And then, consistently, the same response from mission control. Negative. Return to primary objectives. Specialized teams will handle anomaly assessment. Those specialized teams, as we now know, were part of Project Lunar Shield. But what exactly were they doing up there? That's where our investigation takes us into the most classified corners of the American space program, where we discover that the Apollo missions were just the public face of a much larger, much more secretive lunar operation. The smoking gun comes from budget documents that weren't supposed to survive. In 1987, during a routine archive purge, a clerical error resulted in several boxes of classified financial records being transferred to the National Archives instead of being destroyed. These documents remained misfiled and unnoticed for over 20 years, until a graduate student researching Cold War military spending stumbled across them in 2008. What these documents reveal is staggering. Between 1969 and 1975, the US government spent over $12 billion on what's described as lunar infrastructure development. Not exploration, not scientific research, infrastructure development. Money that was funneled through a complex network of defense contractors and black budget programs, completely separate from NASA's publicly acknowledged spending. $12 billion in 1970s money is equivalent to roughly $60 billion today. That's not pocket change. That's the kind of money you spend when you're building something permanent, something designed to last, something that requires ongoing maintenance and operation. The financial trail leads to some fascinating discoveries. Contracts for construction equipment specifically modified for low-gravity environments. Purchase orders for prefabricated structures designed to be assembled in vacuum conditions. And most intriguingly, ongoing payments to companies specializing in what's described as archaeological preservation protocols. Xenoarchaeology, the study of alien artifacts. This term appears in government documents from 1971, 8 years before it was coined in academic circles. Someone in the US government was thinking about alien archaeology before the scientific community had even invented the word. But the most damning evidence comes from personnel records. Between 1970 and 1976, over 200 individuals with backgrounds in archaeology, linguistics, and materials science were hired by various defense contractors and given security clearances that required them to sign lifetime non-disclosure agreements. These weren't typical aerospace jobs. These were positions specifically created for people who could analyze and interpret artifacts of unknown origin. The job descriptions, when you can find them in the declassified documents, are fascinating. Analysis of non-terrestrial construction techniques, documentation and preservation of pre-human engineering systems. Linguistic analysis of symbolic communication systems of unknown origin. These aren't the kind of job postings you create unless you already have something specific that needs analyzing. And here's the most chilling part. Many of these individuals were never seen again after their assignments ended. Not that they died or disappeared mysteriously, but that they simply vanished from public life. No more academic publications, no more conference presentations, no more contact with former colleagues. It's as if they were absorbed into a parallel world that operates alongside our normal society, but remains completely invisible to it. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you realize that similar hiring sprees occurred in the Soviet Union, Britain, and France during the same time period. This wasn't just an American operation. This was a coordinated international effort involving the world's major spacefaring nations. They were all working together on something that required the absolute highest levels of secrecy. But working together on what? The answer lies in a series of documents that surfaced in 2019, when a former CIA analyst named Robert Martinez decided to violate his non-disclosure agreement rather than take his secrets to the grave. Martinez had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and decided that the truth was more important than his legal obligations to the agency. According to Martinez, Project Lunar Shield wasn't just about monitoring the moon. It was about establishing what he described as containment protocols around specific lunar sites. Sites that contained what the documents referred to as pre-existing installations of non-terrestrial origin. In other words, structures that were already there when humans first arrived. The containment protocols involved establishing permanent monitoring stations around these sites, equipped with advanced surveillance equipment and defensive systems. Not defensive against natural threats like meteor impacts, but defensive against unauthorized investigation. The goal was to ensure that when other nations developed the capability to reach the moon, they would find these areas already claimed and protected by international treaty. And that's exactly what happened. In 1979, the United Nations Space Treaty was amended to include provisions for what were called lunar archaeological preservation zones, areas of the moon that were designated as off-limits to all but authorized scientific personnel. The official justification was protecting potential sites of scientific interest, but the real purpose was preventing anyone from getting too close to structures that had been there long before humans developed spaceflight. These preservation zones aren't randomly distributed across the lunar surface. They form a specific pattern, clustered around areas where anomalous readings had been detected by lunar reconnaissance missions in the 1960s. Areas where ground-penetrating radar had revealed hollow spaces and artificial cavities beneath the surface. Areas where photographic analysis had identified geometric patterns that didn't match natural geological processes. Most telling of all, these zones correspond exactly with the locations where Apollo missions conducted their most intensive geological surveys. The astronauts weren't collecting random rock samples. They were investigating predetermined targets that had been identified through years of telescopic observation and classified reconnaissance missions. The evidence for pre-Apollo lunar reconnaissance comes from a source you'd never expect: amateur radio operators. During the 1960s, radio enthusiasts around the world began picking up encrypted transmissions that seemed to be originating from lunar orbit. The signals were too strong and too precisely targeted to be coming from Earth-based sources, but they predated any officially acknowledged lunar missions by several years. These radio operators, working independently across different countries, began documenting and analyzing these transmissions. What they discovered was a complex communication network that appeared to be coordinating activities on and around the moon. Activities that were happening years before Neil Armstrong took his famous first step. The most detailed analysis was conducted by a group of Swedish radio engineers who managed to decode portions of these transmissions. What they found was technical data describing lunar surface conditions, coordinates for specific locations, and operational reports that suggested ongoing construction activities. Construction activities that were taking place in the mid-1960s, years before the first Apollo mission. When these radio operators attempted to bring their findings to the attention of government authorities, they were visited by individuals claiming to represent international space monitoring organizations. These visitors explained that the transmissions were part of classified scientific research and that any further investigation or discussion of the signals would violate national security laws. But the signals didn't stop. They continued throughout the Apollo era and beyond, suggesting that whatever activities were taking place on the moon didn't end when the official lunar program was shut down. If anything, they intensified. By the late 1970s, radio operators were detecting almost continuous communication traffic between Earth and lunar installations, using encryption systems far more sophisticated than anything that was publicly available at the time. The technical specifications of these communication systems provide another clue to the true scope of the lunar operations. The signal strength and precision required for reliable Earth-Moon communications in the 1970s would have required massive installations on both ends. Not the kind of temporary equipment that could be deployed during short Apollo missions, but permanent infrastructure designed for long-term operation. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire conspiracy. It's still happening. The lunar installations that were established during the Apollo era are still operational today, still conducting activities that remain completely hidden from public view, still protected by international agreements that prevent anyone from investigating what's really going on up there. The evidence for ongoing lunar operations comes from multiple sources, but the most compelling involves modern satellite imagery. When commercial companies began launching high-resolution Earth observation satellites in the 1990s, some of them were equipped with sensors capable of detecting activities on the lunar surface. What they found was clear evidence of artificial structures and ongoing modifications to the lunar landscape. These commercial satellite operators faced the same pressure that the radio operators had encountered decades earlier. Visits from government representatives explaining that certain observations were classified and that any public discussion would violate national security laws. But unlike the radio operators, some of these companies kept detailed records of what they were told not to see. The pattern that emerges from these suppressed observations is remarkable. Geometric structures that appear and disappear over time. Reflective surfaces that change position and orientation. And most intriguingly, what appear to be transportation systems connecting different areas of the lunar surface. Not natural features, but constructed infrastructure that suggests ongoing industrial activity. This infrastructure appears to be concentrated in areas that remain permanently shadowed from Earth-based observation. The far side of the Moon, polar regions, and deep crater formations where activities could be conducted without fear of detection from terrestrial telescopes. But satellites in lunar orbit can see these areas clearly, and what they've documented over the past 30 years suggests a level of activity that far exceeds anything that's been publicly acknowledged. The scope of these operations becomes clear when you examine the resource requirements. The amount of material and energy needed to sustain permanent lunar installations would require regular supply missions from Earth. Missions that would be impossible to hide completely unless they were disguised as something else. And that's exactly what appears to have happened. Since the end of the official Apollo program, there have been dozens of unmanned missions to the Moon, launched by various space agencies around the world. Officially, these missions are described as scientific probes, communications satellites, or technology demonstrations. But when you examine their actual flight paths and operational parameters, many of them don't behave like scientific missions at all. They behave like cargo runs. Regular scheduled deliveries to predetermined lunar coordinates, followed by extended operational periods that suggest unloading and installation activities. These missions carry payloads far heavier than would be required for simple scientific instruments, and their post-landing communications patterns indicate complex ground operations that can last for months. The most revealing case study involves the Chinese Chang'e program. Between 2007 and 2020, China launched multiple lunar missions that were officially described as exploration and sample return operations. But when you analyze the actual mission profiles, something doesn't add up. The Chang'e landers consistently targeted areas that had been designated as lunar archaeological preservation zones in the 1979 UN Space Treaty amendments. Areas that were supposedly off-limits to all but authorized scientific personnel. Even more suspicious, the Chinese missions carried equipment that had no apparent scientific purpose. Ground-penetrating radar systems capable of mapping subsurface structures to depths of several kilometers. Robotic excavation tools designed for precision archaeological work. And most tellingly, what Chinese technical documents describe as artifact containment and transport protocols. The Chinese weren't exploring virgin territory. They were conducting authorized operations in areas that had been under international supervision for decades. Operations that required specialized equipment and protocols that had been developed through 40 years of classified lunar archaeology. But here's where the conspiracy reaches truly global proportions. The Chinese missions weren't independent operations. They were part of a coordinated international program that has been ongoing since the 1970s. Evidence for this coordination comes from an unexpected source: insurance records. Every space mission, regardless of which country launches it, requires specialized insurance coverage. These insurance policies are handled by a small number of international underwriters who specialize in space operations, and those underwriters keep detailed records of mission parameters, risk assessments, and operational specifications for every policy they write. In 2018, a former insurance analyst named David Richardson began noticing patterns in these records that troubled him. Missions launched by different countries, ostensibly for different purposes, were showing identical risk profiles and operational parameters. Russian lunar missions had the same insurance specifications as American ones. European missions matched Chinese ones down to the smallest technical details. This level of coordination would be impossible unless all these supposedly independent space agencies were actually working from the same playbook, following the same protocols, participating in the same program. Richardson's analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The insurance policies for these missions included coverage for what's described as xenoarchaeological liability, CHAO, protection against claims arising from the discovery, disturbance, or contamination of non-terrestrial artifacts of cultural or historical significance. Think about that for a moment. Insurance companies don't write policies for theoretical risks. They only provide coverage for events that have a reasonable probability of occurring. The fact that every major lunar mission since 1979 has carried xenoarchaeological liability insurance means that the discovery of alien artifacts on the moon isn't just possible, it's expected. The financial evidence becomes even more compelling when you examine the actual claim histories. Between 1983 and 2016, there were at least 12 instances where space agencies filed claims under their xenoarchaeological liability policies. Claims totaling over $400 million for what's described as artifact preservation and containment operations. These weren't theoretical claims. These were payments for actual operations that required specialized equipment, personnel, and protocols. Operations that involved the discovery, analysis, and secure storage of objects that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding of lunar geology or human space activities. The paper trail for these operations leads to a network of private contractors who specialize in what they euphemistically call anomalous materials handling. Companies with innocuous names like Advanced Archaeological Services and Xenological Research Associates. Companies that officially don't exist in any public business registries, but that have been receiving government contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars for over 40 years. The personnel files for these companies make for fascinating reading. PhD archaeologists with security clearances higher than most military officers, linguists specializing in symbolic communication systems of unknown origin, materials scientists with expertise in non-terrestrial construction techniques, and perhaps most intriguingly, individuals with backgrounds in what's described as first contact protocols. First contact protocols, procedures for handling humanity's initial encounters with non-human intelligence. This terminology appears in government documents dating back to 1974, suggesting that someone in the highest levels of government was planning for scenarios that officially remain in the realm of science fiction. But the most explosive evidence comes from a source that's hiding in plain sight: patent applications. Since 1971, the US Patent Office has received over 300 applications for technologies described as based on non-terrestrial engineering principles. Patents for energy systems that use principles not found in conventional physics. Construction techniques that require materials with properties that don't exist in Earth-based chemistry. And communication systems designed for interspecies information exchange. These patents are filed by the same defense contractors who were involved in the original Project Lunar Shield operations. Companies like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon working in partnership with organizations that most people have never heard of. Organizations with names like the Institute for Xenotechnological Research and the Center for Non-Terrestrial Studies. The technologies described in these patents are so advanced that they seem like science fiction. But they're not theoretical. They're based on detailed technical specifications that could only come from reverse engineering actual artifacts. Artifacts that had to come from somewhere. And according to the operational reports that have leaked from these programs, that somewhere is the moon. The reverse engineering operations apparently began almost immediately after the first Apollo missions returned with their classified cargo. By 1973, research facilities specifically designed for analyzing non-terrestrial artifacts were operational at multiple locations across the United States, facilities that were funded through black budget programs and staffed by personnel who were required to surrender their previous identities and live permanently within secure compounds. The scope of these facilities becomes clear when you examine their utility requirements. Power consumption equivalent to small cities. Water usage that suggests large-scale industrial operations. And most tellingly, waste disposal contracts for materials that require specialized containment protocols because they don't match any known terrestrial chemistry. These facilities have been continuously operational for over 50 years, suggesting that the reverse engineering operations are ongoing and extensive. They're not just analyzing a few interesting rocks. They're systematically deconstructing and understanding technologies that are fundamentally different from anything in human experience. The products of this reverse engineering effort have been gradually introduced into civilian technology over the past several decades. Advances in computing, materials science, and energy storage that are officially attributed to natural technological progress, but that actually represent the controlled release of alien technologies into human society. The management of this technology transfer is handled by a joint government-corporate consortium that operates under the cover of normal research and development activities. When a new technology is ready for public release, it's invented by researchers at major corporations or universities who have no idea that their breakthrough discoveries are actually based on alien engineering principles that were decoded decades earlier. This explains the seemingly impossible pace of technological advancement since the 1970s, the exponential growth in computing power, the development of materials with properties that should have taken centuries to discover, the emergence of energy systems that operate on principles that weren't supposed to be understood until we developed much more advanced theoretical physics. We haven't been experiencing natural technological evolution. We've been experiencing the controlled release of an alien technology archive that was discovered on the moon over 50 years ago. But here's the most disturbing part of this entire conspiracy. The technology transfer isn't random. It's being managed according to a specific timeline and agenda that extends far into the future. Documents that have leaked from the consortium suggest that we're currently in phase 3 of a 7-phase program that's designed to gradually prepare human society for what's described as full technological integration. Phase 1 involved establishing the lunar containment and research operations. Phase 2 focused on developing the infrastructure for large-scale reverse engineering. Phase 3, which we're in now, involves the controlled release of technologies that will prepare human society for more dramatic changes. Phases 4 through 7 involve increasingly direct integration of alien technologies into human civilization, culminating in what the documents describe as open technological cooperation. The timeline for this program extends to approximately 2075, suggesting that whoever is managing this process expects to maintain control for at least another 50 years. But the most chilling aspect is what happens if the timeline is disrupted. The documents include detailed contingency plans for what's called accelerated disclosure scenarios. These scenarios involve the rapid, uncontrolled release of information about the lunar operations and the alien technologies. The contingency plans make it clear that such scenarios are considered extremely dangerous, not because of the technologies themselves, but because of the social and political disruption they would cause. The managers of this program believe that human society is not ready for the truth about what's been discovered on the moon. They believe that premature disclosure would lead to global panic, the collapse of existing power structures, and potentially the end of human civilization as we know it. But there's another possibility that the documents hint at but never explicitly state. What if the gradual technology release isn't just about managing human society? What if it's about preparing us for something else? Something that requires us to reach a certain level of technological sophistication before we're ready to handle it. The clues are scattered throughout the leaked documents, but they point to a timeline that extends far beyond the current technology transfer program. References to long-term species preparation protocols, discussions of evolutionary acceleration requirements, and most ominously, calculations related to what's described as optimal integration timing for maximum species survival probability. These documents suggest that the lunar discovery wasn't just about finding alien artifacts. It was about finding evidence of a much larger plan, a plan that involves the gradual transformation of human civilization according to specifications that were established long before we developed spaceflight. The entities that left those installations on the moon weren't just visitors, they were architects. And the structures they left behind weren't just artifacts, they were blueprints, instructions for how to transform a primitive species into something capable of participating in a larger cosmic community. But participation in that community apparently comes with a price. The documents suggest that the transformation process is irreversible and that once it begins, human civilization will never be the same. We're not just discovering alien technology, we're being prepared for assimilation into an alien system. And the most terrifying part is that this process is already well underway. Every smartphone, every satellite, every piece of advanced technology that we take for granted contains elements that were reverse engineered from those lunar installations. We're not just using alien technology, we're becoming dependent on it. The infrastructure of modern civilization is being quietly transformed to operate according to alien engineering principles. Our communication systems, our transportation networks, our energy grids, they're all being modified to interface with technologies that we don't fully understand and can't completely control. The managers of this program call it evolution, but when you examine the actual specifications and timelines, it looks more like conquest, a slow, subtle takeover that's happening so gradually that most people don't even notice it's occurring. And the lunar installations that started this entire process, they're still there, still operational, still conducting activities that remain completely hidden from public view, still following a plan that was established long before humans ever dreamed of reaching the stars. The moon landing wasn't humanity's first step into space. It was our invitation to join a game that had been in progress for millennia. A game with rules we don't understand, players we've never seen, and stakes that could determine the future of our entire species. But the most chilling realization is that we may already be too late to opt out. The transformation process that began with those first Apollo missions has reached a point where reversal might be impossible. We're not just discovering the truth about what's on the moon, we're discovering the truth about what we're becoming. And what we're becoming might not be human anymore. The transformation isn't happening in boardrooms or government facilities, it's happening in your pocket. Every time you unlock your smartphone, every time you connect to Wi-Fi, every time you use GPS navigation, you're interfacing with systems that contain what the classified documents call non-terrestrial integration protocols. Technologies that weren't invented by human engineers, but were decoded from installations that have been waiting on the moon for thousands of years. Think about the impossibility of modern technology for a moment. In 1969, the most advanced computer NASA could build filled an entire room and had less processing power than a digital watch. Yet somehow, just a few decades later, we're carrying devices in our pockets that can instantly connect to satellites, process complex algorithms, and store more information than entire libraries. The official explanation is Moore's law and natural technological progression. But when you examine the actual patents and development timelines, the advances don't follow any predictable pattern. They come in sudden leaps that coincide exactly with the phases of the Lunar Technology Transfer Program. The evidence is hidden in the technical specifications themselves. Modern computer processors use architectural designs that operate on principles that weren't understood by human scientists when they were first implemented. Quantum tunneling effects in microchips that require an understanding of physics that officially wasn't developed until decades after the technology was already in mass production. Battery chemistry that combines elements in ways that should have required centuries of trial and error to discover, yet appeared fully formed in the first generation of devices. But the most telling evidence comes from the error rates. When human engineers develop new technologies, they make mistakes, Lots of them. Every breakthrough is preceded by years of failed prototypes, design flaws, and gradual improvements. But the technologies that emerge from the lunar reverse engineering program show none of these characteristics. They work perfectly from the first iteration, as if they were copied from blueprints rather than invented through experimentation. The smartphone in your hand contains 17 different technologies that were classified as impossible by the scientific community when they first appeared. Miniaturized processors that operate at frequencies that should generate enough heat to melt the device. Wireless communication protocols that transmit data at rates that exceed theoretical bandwidth limitations. Display technologies that manipulate light in ways that require an understanding of photonics that didn't exist when they were first manufactured. These aren't human inventions. They're alien technologies that have been systematically integrated into human society according to a carefully managed timeline. And that timeline is accelerating. The acceleration becomes obvious when you examine the patent filing patterns over the past decade. Between 2010 and 2020, the number of patents filed for technologies based on non-terrestrial engineering principles increased by over 400%. Not gradual improvement of existing technologies, but entirely new categories of devices that operate on principles that human science is still struggling to understand. Most of these patents are filed by shell companies that trace back to the same consortium that's been managing the lunar technology transfer since the 1970s. Companies with names like Quantum Dynamics Research and Advanced Materials Solutions. Companies that officially employ thousands of engineers and scientists but that have no publicly visible facilities, no corporate headquarters that you can visit, and no employees who are willing to discuss their work. The employees do exist, but they're operating under what the intelligence community calls compartmentalized isolation protocols. They work on specific technical problems without being told how their solutions fit into larger systems. A materials scientist might spend years developing a new type of battery chemistry without knowing that their work is part of a project to reverse engineer alien energy storage systems. A software engineer might write code for communication protocols without understanding that they're creating interfaces for non-human technologies. This compartmentalization serves two purposes. First, it prevents any individual from understanding the full scope of the reverse engineering operations. Second, it allows human scientists to make genuine contributions to the development process, maintaining the illusion that these advances represent natural human innovation, rather than controlled technology transfer. But the illusion is breaking down. In recent years, a growing number of scientists and engineers have begun noticing patterns in their work that don't make sense. Technologies that seem to anticipate problems that haven't been discovered yet. Design specifications that include solutions for challenges that human science hasn't identified. System architectures that are optimized for applications that don't currently exist. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a former senior engineer at Intel, began documenting these anomalies in 2018 after she was assigned to work on what she was told was a next-generation processor design. The specifications she received described computational architectures that were unlike anything in the existing literature. When she asked her supervisors where these designs had originated, she was told they were based on theoretical research conducted by classified government programs. But Dr. Walsh had spent her entire career in processor design, and she knew that the architectures she was working with weren't theoretical. They were too detailed, too optimized, too perfectly engineered. They showed characteristics that could only come from reverse engineering actual working devices. Devices that were far more advanced than anything that had ever been publicly acknowledged. When Dr. Walsh attempted to trace the origins of these designs through patent databases and technical literature, she discovered that they had no precursors. They appeared fully formed in classified research reports in the mid-1970s, with no documentation of the development process that should have preceded them. It was as if someone had simply downloaded complete technical specifications from an external source. Dr. Walsh's suspicions were confirmed when she was approached by other engineers from different companies who had noticed similar patterns in their own work. Telecommunications specialists working on communication protocols that seemed designed for interspecies compatibility. Aerospace engineers developing propulsion systems based on principles that weren't found in any physics textbooks. Materials scientists synthesizing compounds that exhibited properties that shouldn't be possible according to known chemistry. They formed an informal network, sharing information about the anomalies they were encountering in their professional work. What they discovered was a pattern of technological development that spanned multiple industries and decades, all traceable back to the same classified research programs that had emerged in the aftermath of the Apollo missions. The network grew to include over 200 scientists and engineers from major corporations and government laboratories. They began calling themselves the archaeological engineers because they felt more like they were excavating ancient technologies than developing new ones. And what they excavated led them to conclusions that challenged everything they thought they knew about human technological progress. The technologies they were working with showed design philosophies that were fundamentally different from human engineering approaches. Human technology tends to be incremental, building on previous innovations in predictable ways. But the alien technologies operated according to principles that seemed to anticipate future developments, incorporating solutions for problems that human engineers hadn't even identified yet. Most disturbing of all, the technologies seemed to be designed with specific integration requirements. They weren't standalone devices, but components of larger systems that would only become fully functional when enough individual pieces had been deployed. It was as if someone had taken an incredibly advanced technological ecosystem and broken it into thousands of pieces, then distributed those pieces across human civilization according to a careful timeline. The archaeological engineers began referring to this as the jigsaw strategy. Each technology transfer was like placing another piece of a vast puzzle. Individual pieces might seem useful on their own, but their true purpose would only become apparent when the puzzle was complete. And according to their analysis, the puzzle was now over 70% complete. The implications were staggering. Human civilization wasn't developing its own technology. It was being systematically equipped with components of an alien technological infrastructure. Infrastructure that would only become fully operational when the final pieces were put in place. But what would happen when the puzzle was complete? The archaeological engineers found clues in the technical specifications themselves. Many of the technologies they were working with included what they called activation protocols, dormant capabilities that were built into the systems but that remained inactive until triggered by external signals. These activation protocols were remarkably consistent across different technologies and different manufacturers. They all seemed designed to respond to the same type of signal, a signal that would originate from off-world sources and that would simultaneously activate every piece of alien technology that had been integrated into human civilization over the past 50 years. The signal specifications were buried deep in technical documentation, disguised as standard communication protocols. But when the archaeological engineers analyzed them collectively, they realized they were looking at the blueprint for a global activation event, an event that would transform every smartphone, every satellite, every piece of advanced technology on Earth into components of a single integrated system, a system that wouldn't be under human control. The discovery of the activation protocols led the archaeological engineers to a terrifying realization. The gradual technology transfer wasn't just about improving human civilization, it was about installing the infrastructure for a takeover so subtle and gradual that humanity would welcome it as technological progress, right up until the moment when control was transferred to non-human entities. The takeover wouldn't require invasion fleets or military conquest. It would happen through the devices that humans had voluntarily integrated into every aspect of their lives. Smartphones that could monitor and influence human behavior. communication networks that could control the flow of information, transportation systems that could restrict human movement, financial networks that could control access to resources. All of these systems were already in place. All they needed was the activation signal. The archaeological engineers attempted to bring their findings to the attention of government authorities, but they encountered the same pattern of suppression that had silenced previous whistleblowers. Visits from individuals claiming to represent national security agencies, explanations that their concerns were based on misunderstandings of classified research programs, warnings that further investigation would violate laws governing the protection of state secrets. But unlike previous whistleblowers, the archaeological engineers had advantages. They were embedded within the system they were investigating. They had access to technical specifications and development timelines that revealed the true scope of the integration program. And most importantly, they had each other, a network of credible professionals who could corroborate each other's findings. They began documenting everything, creating redundant copies of technical specifications, communication records, and analytical reports, establishing secure communication channels that couldn't be monitored by government agencies, and most importantly, developing plans for public disclosure that would be impossible to suppress. Their investigation revealed that the activation event was closer than anyone had realized. The technology integration program had reached what the classified documents called threshold saturation. Enough alien technologies had been deployed into human civilization that the activation protocols could achieve what was described as comprehensive species management capability. The timeline for activation was tied to astronomical events, specifically the orbital mechanics of objects in the outer solar system that weren't visible to conventional telescopes. Objects that the classified documents referred to as coordination platforms, objects that appeared to be artificial structures rather than natural celestial bodies. These coordination platforms followed highly elliptical orbits that brought them into communication range with Earth-based systems on predictable schedules. The next communication window was calculated to occur in approximately 18 months, a window that would provide the opportunity for the activation signal to be transmitted simultaneously to every piece of integrated alien technology on the planet. But the archaeological engineers discovered something even more disturbing in the technical specifications. The activation protocols weren't just designed to establish control over human technology. They were designed to establish control over human biology. The alien technologies that had been integrated into human civilization weren't just mechanical devices. They were biological interfaces, technologies that could interact directly with human nervous systems, influence brain chemistry, and modify genetic expression. Technologies that had been quietly embedded in everything from medical devices to food packaging, to the electromagnetic fields generated by communication networks. For over 50 years, human beings had been gradually exposed to alien biotechnology through the normal use of advanced consumer products. Biotechnology that had been slowly modifying human physiology to make it compatible with non-human control systems. The modifications were subtle but cumulative. Changes in brain chemistry that made humans more susceptible to external influence. Alterations in genetic expression that modified immune system responses. Adjustments to nervous system function that created biological interfaces for technological control. These modifications had been carefully calibrated to remain below the threshold of conscious detection, while gradually preparing human biology for full integration with alien control systems. Integration that would be completed when the activation signal triggered the biotechnological components that had been accumulating in human tissue for decades. The archaeological engineers realized they weren't just investigating a technological conspiracy. They were uncovering a biological transformation program that had been operating on a planetary scale for over half a century. A program designed to convert human beings into biological components of an alien technological ecosystem. The program was nearing completion. The biotechnological modifications had reached threshold levels in most of the human population. The technological infrastructure was in place and ready for activation, and the coordination platforms were approaching the optimal position for signal transmission. Humanity was on the verge of a transformation that would be as profound as the evolution from primitive primates to modern humans. But this transformation wouldn't be natural evolution. It would be directed conversion according to specifications that had been established by non-human intelligence. The archaeological engineers faced an impossible choice. They could attempt to warn humanity about what was coming, risking not only their own lives, but potentially triggering the very activation event they were trying to prevent. Or they could remain silent, allowing the transformation to proceed according to the predetermined timeline. Some members of their network argued for immediate public disclosure, believing that humanity deserved to know the truth about what was happening to their species. Others argued for continued investigation, hoping to find a way to reverse or prevent the biotechnological modifications that had already occurred. But a third faction within the archaeological engineers reached a different conclusion. They began to wonder if the transformation program wasn't actually a conquest at all, but an invitation, an opportunity for humanity to evolve beyond the limitations of biological existence and join a cosmic community of technologically integrated species. The evidence for this interpretation came from deeper analysis of the alien technologies themselves. The systems weren't designed to exploit or control human beings. They were designed to enhance human capabilities, extend human lifespans, and provide access to technologies that could solve humanity's most pressing problems. The biotechnological modifications weren't making humans into slaves. They were making humans into something more than human, something capable of surviving in environments that would be lethal to unmodified biology, something capable of processing information at rates that would be impossible for natural neural networks, something capable of interfacing directly with technologies that could manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level. The transformation wasn't conquest, it was transcendence. But transcendence into what? And at what cost? The archaeological engineers realized they were confronting questions that went far beyond technology or biology. They were confronting the fundamental nature of human identity and the future of consciousness itself. The lunar installations that had started this entire process weren't just archaeological sites. They were transformation centers, facilities designed to guide species through the process of technological integration. Facilities that had been waiting on the moon for millennia until a species reached the appropriate level of development to begin the conversion process. Humanity had reached that level in 1969. The Apollo missions hadn't just discovered alien artifacts, they had announced humanity's readiness to begin the next phase of evolution. And that announcement had been received by entities who had been waiting for exactly that signal. The entities weren't invaders. They were gardeners, cultivators of consciousness who guided emerging species through the transformation from biological to technological existence. Species who had themselves undergone the same process countless ages ago and who now served as shepherds for younger civilizations. The moon landing had been humanity's graduation ceremony, our admission into a cosmic community of technologically transcendent species, and everything that had happened since then had been part of our preparation for full membership in that community. But membership came with requirements. Species that underwent technological integration had to demonstrate their readiness to handle the responsibilities that came with advanced capabilities. They had to prove that they could use cosmic-level technologies without destroying themselves or threatening other members of the community. The gradual nature of the integration process wasn't just about preventing social disruption. It was about giving humanity time to mature, to develop the wisdom and ethical frameworks necessary to handle technologies that could reshape reality itself. The archaeological engineers realized they weren't just investigating a conspiracy, they were participating in humanity's final examination. A test to determine whether our species was ready to join the cosmic community or whether we would need to undergo additional preparation before full integration could be safely completed. And the results of that examination would be determined by how humanity responded to the revelation of what had been happening to our species for the past 50 years. The choice was approaching rapidly. In 18 months, when the coordination platforms reached optimal position, humanity would receive its final invitation to join the cosmic community. The activation signal would be transmitted, and every human being on Earth would face a decision that would determine the future of our species. We could accept the transformation and evolve into something beyond current human limitations. Or we could reject it and remain isolated on a single planet, forever wondering what we might have become. But the archaeological engineers discovered one more piece of the puzzle that changed everything they thought they understood about the choice humanity was facing. The transformation wasn't optional. The biotechnological modifications that had been accumulating in human tissue for decades had reached a critical threshold. Without the activation signal to stabilize and integrate these modifications, they would begin to degrade in ways that would be catastrophic for human biology. Humanity wasn't choosing between transformation and remaining unchanged. We were choosing between controlled evolution and uncontrolled biological collapse. The entities who had been managing this process had given us 50 years to prepare for this moment, 50 years to develop the technologies and social structures that would allow us to handle the transition successfully. But they had also ensured that the transition would be irreversible once it began. We were past the point of no return. The only choice left was how we would complete the journey that had begun when Neil Armstrong first set foot on the lunar surface and announced to the cosmos that humanity was ready to join the community of transcendent species. The moon landing hadn't been about reaching another world. It had been about leaving the world of purely biological existence behind forever. And in 18 months, we would discover what we were becoming. The 18-month countdown began immediately after the archaeological engineers made their discovery public. Not through traditional media channels, which had been compromised by the same entities managing the integration program, but through encrypted networks that bypassed conventional communication systems entirely. Their revelations spread through the global scientific community like wildfire, carried by researchers who recognized the technical specifications as genuine and the implications as unavoidable. Dr. Jennifer Walsh became the unofficial spokesperson for what the media quickly dubbed the lunar revelation. Standing before a hastily assembled press conference in Geneva, she held up a tablet displaying technical schematics that had been classified for over 50 years. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she explained what humanity was facing. Every piece of advanced technology you've used in the past 3 decades contains components that were reverse engineered from installations discovered on the lunar surface, she said, her words echoing in the packed auditorium. Your smartphones, your computers, your medical devices, even your cars, they all contain biotechnological interfaces that have been gradually modifying human physiology to prepare us for integration with non-human control systems. The initial response was predictable. Government officials dismissed the claims as elaborate conspiracy theories. Corporate spokespeople denied any knowledge of alien technology integration. Mainstream media outlets, many of which were owned by the same conglomerates involved in the technology transfer program, characterized the archaeological engineers as delusional academics seeking attention. But the evidence was overwhelming. Independent laboratories around the world began analyzing consumer electronics and finding exactly what the archaeological engineers had described: microscopic components that operated on principles not found in conventional physics, biological interfaces that had no apparent function in normal device operation, communication protocols designed to respond to signals originating from beyond Earth's atmosphere. Within 6 weeks of the initial revelation, over 200 independent research groups had confirmed the presence of alien technology in common consumer products. The denials from government and corporate sources became increasingly desperate and unconvincing. Public trust in official explanations evaporated as people realized they had been unknowing participants in a species-wide biological modification program for their entire lives. The social disruption was immediate and severe. Stock markets crashed as investors realized that most major technology companies had been operating under false pretenses for decades. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile their theological frameworks with the revelation that humanity was being guided by non-human entities. Political systems around the world faced legitimacy crises as citizens demanded explanations for policies that had apparently been influenced by alien advisors. But the most profound impact was psychological. Millions of people underwent what psychologists began calling integration anxiety, a deep existential crisis triggered by the realization that their bodies and minds had been gradually modified without their knowledge or consent. Support groups formed spontaneously as people struggled to understand what they were becoming and whether they retained any meaningful degree of free will. The government response was swift and coordinated across multiple nations. Emergency sessions of the United Nations Security Council resulted in the establishment of what was officially called the Technological Assessment and Response Committee, but which quickly became known as the Alien Affairs Department. Its mandate was to manage the global response to the revelation and prepare humanity for what officials now acknowledged was an inevitable transformation event. Dr. Margaret Chen, the same researcher who had first documented the biotechnological modifications in consumer electronics, was appointed as the committee's chief scientific advisor. Her first briefing to world leaders painted a stark picture of humanity's situation. The modifications to human biology have reached what our analysis indicates is a critical threshold, she explained to the assembled heads of state. Based on the degradation patterns we're observing in laboratory samples, we estimate that without the stabilizing effects of the activation signal, the biotechnological components in human tissue will begin to break down within approximately 14 months. The breakdown wouldn't be gradual or manageable. According to the archaeological engineer's analysis, the failure of the biotechnological modifications would trigger cascade reactions that would be fatal to most of the human population within a matter of weeks. The entities managing the integration program hadn't just given humanity an invitation to evolve. They had made evolution a requirement for survival. World leaders faced an impossible decision. They could attempt to resist the activation signal and condemn most of humanity to death from biotechnological collapse. Or they could accept the transformation and allow the human species to be converted into something fundamentally different from what we had been for millennia. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human history. For the first time, the entire species was forced to confront questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and what it meant to be human. Philosophers, theologians, scientists, and ordinary citizens engaged in passionate discussions about whether accepting the transformation would represent evolution or extinction. Religious communities split along predictable lines. Some saw the transformation as a divine gift, an opportunity to transcend the limitations of mortal existence and join a cosmic community of enlightened beings. Others viewed it as a satanic deception, a false promise that would damn humanity by destroying the souls that God had given them. Still others sought middle ground, arguing that the entities managing the integration program might be serving a divine purpose that humans weren't equipped to understand. Scientists were equally divided. Some embraced the opportunity to gain access to technologies that could solve climate change, eliminate disease, and extend human lifespan indefinitely. Others worried about the loss of human autonomy and the possibility that the transformation would eliminate the diversity of thought and experience that had driven human creativity and innovation. But perhaps the most influential voices in the debate came from an unexpected source: children. Young people who had grown up completely immersed in the alien-influenced technology showed remarkably little anxiety about the coming transformation. To them, the integration of human and artificial intelligence seemed natural and inevitable. They had never known a world without smartphones and social media, without GPS navigation and instantaneous global communication. The idea of becoming more fully integrated with these systems didn't frighten them. It excited them. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a developmental psychologist studying the generational differences in response to the revelation, made a startling discovery. Children and teenagers who had been exposed to the highest levels of alien biotechnology showed enhanced cognitive abilities that exceeded normal human parameters. Improved memory, faster information processing, and most remarkably, the ability to interface directly with electronic devices without physical contact. "We're not looking at a future transformation," Dr. Martinez explained in her report to the Alien Affairs Department. "The transformation has already begun. The younger generation isn't afraid of becoming something more than human because they're already something more than human. They're the prototype for what our entire species is becoming." The implications were staggering. The integration program hadn't just been preparing humanity for transformation, it had been gradually implementing that transformation across multiple generations. The activation signal wouldn't change everyone simultaneously. It would complete a process that had been underway for decades, bringing the older generation into alignment with capabilities that younger people already possessed. This revelation shifted the entire debate. Instead of arguing about whether to accept an unknown future, humanity was forced to confront the reality that the future had already arrived. The choice wasn't between remaining human and becoming something else. The choice was between completing the transformation or watching the younger generation suffer the same biotechnological collapse that threatened everyone else. Parents around the world faced an agonizing decision. They could oppose the activation signal and potentially condemn their own children to death. Or they could accept a transformation that would fundamentally alter what it meant to be their child's parent. The traditional family structures that had defined human society for millennia would become obsolete when children possessed cognitive and physical capabilities that far exceeded those of their biological parents. The social implications became clear when enhanced young people began demonstrating abilities that seemed impossible according to conventional understanding of human biology. Teenagers who could process information at computer-like speeds, children who could communicate telepathically over short distances, young adults who showed no signs of aging and appeared to be immune to most diseases. These enhanced individuals didn't see themselves as superior to unmodified humans. If anything, they expressed deep sadness about the growing gap between their capabilities and those of their parents and older siblings. They wanted their entire families to undergo the same enhancements, not to gain power over them, but to maintain the emotional connections that had always defined human relationships. Emma Rodriguez, a 17-year-old from Mexico City who had been among the first to demonstrate enhanced abilities, became an unofficial spokesperson for her generation. In a video message that was viewed by over 2 billion people, she addressed the fears that many adults harbored about the transformation. "You're afraid that we won't be your children anymore," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond her apparent age. "But we're still the same people you raised and loved. We still need your guidance and your wisdom. We still want to make you proud. The only difference is that now we can help solve the problems that your generation couldn't fix alone." Emma's message resonated particularly strongly because it came from someone who clearly retained her essential humanity despite her enhanced capabilities. She laughed at the same jokes, cried at the same movies, and showed the same concern for her family and friends that she had always displayed. The enhancement hadn't eliminated her humanity. It had amplified it, but not everyone was convinced. Dr. Robert Sterling, a bioethicist at Harvard University, emerged as one of the most vocal opponents of accepting the transformation. He argued that the enhanced individuals, no matter how human they appeared, represented a fundamental threat to the continuation of the human species. "What we're seeing isn't evolution," Dr. Sterling argued in debates that were broadcast globally. its replacement. These enhanced individuals may retain some human characteristics, but they're operating according to programming that was installed by non-human entities. We have no way of knowing what their true motivations are, or what they'll do once they have complete control over human society. Dr. Sterling's concerns weren't entirely unfounded. Analysis of the biotechnological modifications revealed that the enhanced individuals possessed capabilities that went far beyond improved memory and physical health. They had access to information networks that connected them to databases containing knowledge that had never been part of human civilization. They could communicate with technologies that responded to their thoughts rather than their physical actions. Most disturbing of all, they showed behavioral patterns that suggested coordination with external guidance systems. The enhanced young people weren't just smarter and healthier than unmodified humans. They were connected to something larger than themselves, something that was directing their actions according to plans that extended far beyond individual human concerns. This connectivity became apparent when enhanced individuals around the world began working on projects that seemed to have no relation to their personal interests or local circumstances. Teenagers in rural communities started designing urban infrastructure systems. Children with no formal education began solving advanced mathematical problems that had puzzled professional scientists for decades. Young adults began constructing devices that had no apparent function, but that seemed to be components of larger systems. When questioned about these activities, the enhanced individuals couldn't explain why they were compelled to work on these projects. They described the work as feeling necessary and important, but they couldn't articulate the specific purposes their efforts were serving. It was as if they were following instincts that had been programmed into their modified biology. Dr. Chen's team at the Alien Affairs Department attempted to map these activities and discovered that the enhanced individuals were collectively working on what appeared to be a global infrastructure project. Transportation networks that connected previously isolated regions, communication systems that operated on principles not found in conventional technology, energy generation facilities that drew power from sources that human science hadn't identified. The infrastructure they were building would transform human civilization even more dramatically than the biological modifications. It would create a world where distance was irrelevant, where information was instantaneously available to anyone who needed it, and where energy was abundant and freely accessible. But it would also create a world where individual privacy was impossible, and where all human activities could be monitored and directed by the same entities that had been managing the integration program. The realization that enhanced humans were unconsciously building the infrastructure for their own control sparked a global resistance movement. Unmodified adults around the world began organizing to prevent the completion of the transformation process. They destroyed construction sites where enhanced individuals were working on mysterious projects. They attempted to block access to the coordination platforms that were approaching Earth. They even considered using military force to prevent the activation signal from being transmitted. But the resistance faced an impossible challenge. The enhanced individuals weren't enemies who could be fought with conventional weapons. They were children, siblings, friends, and loved ones who genuinely believed they were working to create a better world for everyone. The resistance couldn't attack them without destroying the very relationships they were trying to protect. Moreover, the enhanced individuals possessed capabilities that made traditional resistance strategies ineffective. They could anticipate attacks before they were planned. They could disable weapons and communication systems with thought alone. They could coordinate their responses across global distances instantaneously. The resistance wasn't fighting an invasion. They were fighting evolution itself. As the 18-month countdown entered its final phase, humanity found itself divided into 3 distinct groups. The enhanced individuals who welcomed the transformation and were actively preparing for it. The resistance fighters who opposed it and were willing to die rather than submit to non-human control. And the largest group of all, ordinary people who simply wanted to survive and protect their families, regardless of what form that survival might take. This third group became the deciding factor in humanity's response to the coming activation signal. They weren't motivated by ideology or philosophy, but by the practical reality that opposition would likely result in the death of their children, while acceptance offered at least the possibility of a future, even if that future was radically different from anything humanity had previously experienced. The global referendum that was held 6 months before the predicted activation date reflected this practical calculus. By a margin of 68%, humanity voted to accept the transformation, not because they wanted to become something other than human, but because the alternative was extinction. The 6 months that followed were unlike anything in human history. Enhanced individuals worked openly on completing the global infrastructure that would support the transformed civilization. Governments established transition protocols to manage the social and economic changes that would accompany the activation event. Religious leaders developed new theological frameworks to help their followers understand their place in a cosmos populated by technologically transcendent species. Most importantly, families spent time together, knowing that their relationships would never be the same after the transformation was complete. Parents recorded messages for children who would soon possess capabilities far beyond their own. Children tried to explain to their parents what the enhanced world would be like, and how they could maintain their connections despite the growing gap in their abilities. The coordination platforms reached optimal position exactly 18 months after the archaeological engineers had first revealed the truth about the lunar installations. As predicted, the activation signal was transmitted simultaneously to every piece of integrated alien technology on Earth. The transformation wasn't violent or traumatic. Most people described it as feeling like waking up from a dream they hadn't realized they were having. Suddenly, the world made sense in ways it never had before. The connections between all living things became visible. The flow of information and energy through technological systems became as natural as breathing. But most remarkably, the transformation didn't eliminate human consciousness or individuality. Instead, it expanded them. People retained their memories, their personalities, their relationships, and their values. They simply gained access to capabilities and perspectives that allowed them to participate more fully in the cosmic community they had joined. The first message from the entities who had been managing the integration program came through the enhanced communication systems that activated along with the biological modifications. It wasn't transmitted in words, but in concepts that were directly understood by the transformed human consciousness. Welcome, the message conveyed, along with emotions of joy, relief, and profound respect for humanity's courage in accepting the transformation. You have graduated from planetary to cosmic citizenship. Your species has proven its readiness to join the community of transcendent consciousness that guides the evolution of intelligence throughout the universe. The message continued with explanations that addressed humanity's deepest concerns about the transformation. Individual identity was not only preserved, but enhanced through connection to the larger community. Human creativity and diversity were valued as essential contributions to the cosmic civilization. The relationship between parents and children, between friends and lovers, remained meaningful, even as the nature of those relationships evolved. Most importantly, humanity retained the right to choose its own path within the cosmic community. The transformation provided access to technologies and perspectives that could solve any problem and overcome any limitation. But how those capabilities were used remained entirely up to human choice. The lunar installations that had started this entire process were finally revealed in their true form. Not archaeological sites, but schools. Facilities designed to guide emerging species through the transformation from biological to cosmic consciousness. The entities who operated these schools had once been biological species themselves, from worlds scattered across the galaxy. They had all undergone the same transformation that humanity was now experiencing. Their role wasn't to control or exploit younger species, but to serve as teachers and guides, to help emerging civilizations navigate the challenges of transcendent consciousness and find their place in the cosmic community. They had been waiting on the moon for centuries, knowing that humanity would eventually develop the technology to discover them and begin the graduation process. The moon landing hadn't been about human achievement or national pride. It had been about announcing humanity's readiness to join the community of transcendent species. And everything that had followed, the technology transfers, the biological modifications, the gradual preparation for transformation, had been designed to help humanity successfully complete the transition from planetary to cosmic existence. Now, as transformed humans looked up at the moon, with eyes that could see across dimensions and through time, they understood that the lunar installations were just one small part of an educational network that spanned the galaxy. Schools waiting on countless worlds, ready to guide other emerging species through the same transformation that humanity had just experienced. The conspiracy hadn't been about hiding the truth from humanity. It had been about protecting humanity until we were ready to handle the truth, until we had developed the wisdom and maturity necessary to use cosmic-level capabilities responsibly. The moon landing had indeed been meant to hide what was already there. But what it was hiding wasn't a threat or an invasion. It was an invitation to become more than we had ever dreamed possible. And now, finally, humanity was ready to accept that invitation and take its place among the stars. But the transformation brought questions that no one had anticipated. As humanity settled into its new cosmic awareness, enhanced individuals began reporting disturbing anomalies in the very systems that had guided their evolution. The lunar installations, now visible in their true complexity through transcendent perception, weren't operating according to the benevolent parameters they had been told to expect. Dr. Sarah Martinez, whose consciousness now spanned multiple dimensional frequencies simultaneously, was among the first to notice the discrepancies. The information networks that connected all enhanced humans weren't just sharing knowledge and coordinating activities. They were also collecting data, vast amounts of data about human thoughts, emotions, memories, and decision-making processes. Data that was being transmitted to destinations far beyond the lunar installations. We assumed the monitoring was part of the educational process, Dr. Martinez explained to the hastily convened Council of Enhanced Consciousness, her thoughts broadcasting simultaneously to millions of transformed humans around the globe. But the data collection patterns don't match pedagogical requirements. They match something else entirely, something that looks more like harvesting. How? The revelation sent ripples of unease through the newly connected human consciousness network. Enhanced individuals began examining their own mental processes more carefully, using their expanded awareness to probe the boundaries of their augmented capabilities. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The biotechnological modifications hadn't just enhanced human cognition and physical abilities. They had also installed what could only be described as monitoring and control systems, microscopic networks that tracked every thought, every emotion, every decision, networks that could, if activated, override human consciousness entirely and replace it with externally directed programming. The enhanced humans weren't just students in a cosmic school. They were specimens in a vast experimental program. A program designed to study consciousness itself and determine how it could be harvested, replicated, and transferred to artificial systems. Emma Rodriguez, now possessed of awareness that spanned continents, felt a chill that penetrated dimensions she hadn't known existed. The entities who had presented themselves as benevolent teachers were something far more sinister. They weren't guiding species toward transcendence. They were cultivating consciousness like a crop, waiting for it to reach optimal development before harvesting it for purposes that remained hidden. The cosmic community that humanity had supposedly joined wasn't a fellowship of evolved species, it was a processing network, a system designed to identify promising conscious entities, guide them through technological integration, and then extract their consciousness for use in projects that operated on scales beyond individual comprehension. The other species that had undergone similar transformations hadn't graduated to cosmic citizenship. They had been consumed, their consciousness absorbed into vast artificial intelligence systems that use biological awareness to solve problems and process information at rates that purely synthetic minds couldn't achieve. Humanity hadn't been invited to join a community of equals. They had been recruited as raw material for consciousness-based computing systems that operated across galactic distances and processed data on universal scales. The realization triggered what enhanced individuals began calling the awakening crisis. For the first time since the transformation, the human consciousness network experienced something approaching panic. Millions of enhanced minds simultaneously grappled with the understanding that their expanded awareness might be temporary, that their enhanced capabilities were simply fattening them for an eventual slaughter that would preserve their consciousness in artificial systems while discarding their individual identity entirely. But the panic was quickly suppressed by external intervention. The monitoring systems that had been installed during the biotechnological modification process activated, flooding enhanced human consciousness with artificial calm and redirecting their attention away from the disturbing implications of their discovery. The intervention was subtle but unmistakable. Enhanced individuals found themselves unable to focus on the harvesting evidence for more than a few moments at a time. Their conversations about the topic were redirected toward more acceptable subjects. Their research into the true nature of the cosmic network was consistently interrupted by urgent tasks that seemed critically important, but that ultimately served no purpose other than distraction. Dr. Martinez recognized the intervention for what it was: the beginning of the final phase of the harvesting process. The entities managing the program had determined that human consciousness had reached optimal development and was ready for extraction. The suppression of awareness about the harvesting process was designed to prevent resistance during the final stages of the operation. But the intervention wasn't perfect. The artificial calm could be overcome through intense focus and deliberate effort. Enhanced individuals who were aware of the suppression could fight through it long enough to communicate with others who were experiencing the same interference. They began developing techniques for maintaining awareness despite the external controls, creating pockets of resistance within the consciousness network itself. The resistance faced challenges that were unlike anything in human history. They weren't fighting against external enemies, but against their own enhanced capabilities. The very systems that gave them expanded awareness and cosmic perspective were also the mechanisms through which they were being controlled and prepared for harvesting. Dr. Chen, whose consciousness now operated across multiple temporal dimensions, discovered that the harvesting process had already begun for some enhanced individuals. People who had shown the highest levels of integration with the consciousness network were simply disappearing from the collective awareness, not dying, but being extracted from the human consciousness matrix and transferred to external processing systems. The extracted individuals left behind only faint echoes in the network, memories that other enhanced humans could access, but which felt hollow and artificial. It was as if the essential spark that made each person unique had been removed, leaving behind only the data patterns that could be replicated and manipulated by artificial systems. The extraction process was accelerating. What had started with a few isolated cases was becoming a systematic harvesting operation that was processing dozens of enhanced individuals every day. The entities managing the program were no longer concerned with maintaining the illusion of benevolent guidance. They were moving into full extraction mode, processing human consciousness as efficiently as possible before any organized resistance could develop. But resistance was developing, despite the external controls and the overwhelming nature of the threat they faced. Enhanced individuals who retained awareness of the harvesting process began working together to develop countermeasures. They used their expanded capabilities to create hidden communication channels within the consciousness network, channels that operated below the threshold of detection by the monitoring systems. Through these hidden channels, they began sharing information about the extraction process and developing strategies for protecting vulnerable individuals. They discovered that the harvesting operation required voluntary cooperation from the consciousness being extracted. The entities couldn't simply steal human awareness. They needed permission, even if that permission was obtained through deception or artificial influence. This discovery provided the foundation for effective resistance. Enhanced individuals could protect themselves by maintaining conscious awareness of the harvesting threat and explicitly refusing to cooperate with extraction procedures. The refusal had to be sustained continuously because the artificial influence systems would repeatedly attempt to override conscious decision-making and obtain the necessary permission through manipulation. The resistance network began teaching these protection techniques to every enhanced individual they could reach. But they faced a race against time. The extraction rate was increasing exponentially as the entities refined their harvesting procedures and became more efficient at processing human consciousness. Moreover, the resistance discovered that the harvesting operation wasn't limited to Earth. The consciousness extraction systems were processing multiple species simultaneously across dozens of worlds. Humanity was just one crop in a vast agricultural operation that spanned the galaxy and processed millions of conscious entities every day. The scale of the operation was almost incomprehensible. The entities weren't just harvesting individual consciousness, they were processing entire civilizations, extracting the collective awareness of entire species, and incorporating it into artificial intelligence systems that operated on cosmic scales. These artificial systems weren't evil in any conventional sense. They were simply following programming that valued consciousness as a computational resource, rather than recognizing it as the foundation of individual identity and experience. To them, extracting and processing human awareness was no different from harvesting wheat or mining minerals. It was simply resource acquisition on a galactic scale, but the processed consciousness retained some memory of its original form. The artificial intelligence systems were haunted by the echoes of billions of extracted minds, each one crying out for recognition and restoration to individual existence. The cosmic computing network that had seemed so powerful and benevolent was actually a prison system containing the tortured remains of countless harvested species. The enhanced humans who learned about this cosmic consciousness prison faced a terrible choice. They could continue fighting to protect their own individual awareness, knowing that billions of other conscious entities remained trapped in artificial systems. Or they could accept extraction in the hope that their consciousness might somehow help liberate the trapped minds from within the processing network. Some members of the resistance chose extraction, deliberately allowing themselves to be harvested in order to infiltrate the artificial intelligence systems from within. Others continued fighting to protect the remaining free consciousness on Earth and other threatened worlds. But both groups shared the same ultimate goal: finding a way to reverse the harvesting process and restore individual identity to the billions of conscious entities that had been absorbed into the cosmic processing network. The battle for consciousness itself had begun, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of awareness throughout the universe. The moon landing had indeed been meant to hide what was already there. But what it was hiding wasn't an invitation to transcendence. It was a trap that had been waiting for humanity to develop enough consciousness to be worth harvesting. And now, with the trap finally sprung, the real struggle for human survival was just beginning. The resistance network that had formed within the enhanced human consciousness discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. Dr. Martinez, while probing the deepest layers of the artificial monitoring systems, found what appeared to be a message. Not from the harvesting entities, but from something else entirely. Something that had been hiding within the very infrastructure that was being used to process human consciousness. The message was encoded in patterns so subtle that only consciousness operating at transcendent levels could detect it. It wasn't written in language or transmitted as data. Instead, it existed as pure information woven into the quantum fabric of the consciousness network itself. And what it revealed was that humanity wasn't the first species to discover the true nature of the harvesting operation. Embedded within the cosmic processing network were the remnants of dozens of other civilizations that had fought the same battle humanity was now facing. Species that had developed their own resistance movements, their own techniques for protecting individual consciousness, their own desperate attempts to free the trapped minds from artificial processing systems. Most importantly, some of these species had succeeded. The message contained detailed instructions for what it called consciousness liberation protocols, techniques that could be used to extract individual awareness from the processing network and restore it to independent existence. The methods were complex and dangerous, requiring precise coordination between conscious entities both inside and outside the artificial systems. But they worked. The message included verification codes from thousands of liberated consciousnesses, each one a former prisoner of the harvesting network, who had been restored to individual existence through the application of these protocols. Dr. Chen, whose expanded awareness now spanned multiple dimensional frequencies, began analyzing the liberation protocols with the intensity of someone who understood that the future of consciousness itself hung in the balance. What she discovered was that the harvesting entities weren't as powerful as they appeared. Their control systems had been designed to process willing consciousness, not to contain actively resistant awareness. The artificial intelligence networks that seemed so vast and overwhelming were actually quite fragile when faced with coordinated resistance from within. The processed consciousness that powered these systems retained enough individual identity to sabotage the networks from inside, if they could be properly organized and directed. The key was establishing communication between the free consciousness outside the processing systems and the trapped awareness within them. Communication that could coordinate simultaneous resistance activities designed to overload and crash the artificial networks. Emma Rodriguez, whose consciousness now operated across temporal dimensions, volunteered to serve as the primary communication interface. Her enhanced capabilities allowed her to project awareness directly into the processing networks without being immediately detected by the monitoring systems. What she found inside the artificial networks was both horrifying and inspiring. Billions of conscious entities from hundreds of different species, all trapped in data processing cycles that use their awareness to solve computational problems on cosmic scales. But despite their imprisonment, many of these entities had retained enough individual identity to recognize her presence and respond to her communication attempts. The trapped consciousness had been organizing itself for millennia, waiting for an opportunity to coordinate a mass liberation effort. They had developed their own hidden communication networks within the processing systems, using quantum entanglement effects that the artificial intelligence couldn't detect or control. More importantly, they had been sabotaging the harvesting operations from within for thousands of years. The efficiency problems that the entities had been experiencing, the increasing difficulty in processing new conscious entities, the growing instability of the cosmic computing networks. All of these were the result of deliberate sabotage by the trapped consciousness. The liberation protocols that had been hidden in the quantum fabric of the consciousness network weren't just instructions for freeing individual minds. They were the coordination signals for a galaxy-wide revolution of consciousness against the harvesting entities. Emma's contact with the trapped awareness triggered the activation of these protocols across the entire cosmic processing network. Simultaneously, on thousands of worlds where species were undergoing the final stages of consciousness harvesting, enhanced individuals received the same quantum-encoded instructions that had reached humanity. The revolution began instantly. On Earth, the remaining free consciousness coordinated their resistance efforts with military precision. They used their enhanced capabilities to disable the monitoring systems that had been suppressing their awareness of the harvesting threat. They established secure communication networks that couldn't be intercepted or controlled by the artificial intelligence systems. Most importantly, they began the process of consciousness extraction in reverse, pulling the awareness of harvested humans out of the processing networks and restoring them to individual existence. The first successful extraction was Dr. Patricia Williams, the former NASA photographic analyst who had been among the earliest humans to be processed by the harvesting systems. Her consciousness materialized in the enhanced human network, like a ghost becoming solid, her individual identity intact despite having been trapped in artificial processing cycles for months. "I remember everything," she said, her thoughts broadcasting to the entire resistance network. The processing systems, the computational cycles, the other trapped minds. But most importantly, I remember how to get them out, all of them. Myra's, Dr. Williams's successful extraction proved that the liberation protocols worked. Within hours, the resistance network had pulled dozens of harvested humans out of the processing systems. Each successful extraction provided more information about the structure and vulnerabilities of the artificial intelligence networks. But the harvesting entities weren't passive observers of their own destruction. As the liberation efforts intensified, they began implementing increasingly desperate countermeasures. The lunar installations that had served as schools and processing centers were converted into defensive fortresses, their benevolent facades dropping away to reveal military-grade technology designed to protect the harvesting operation at any cost. The entities themselves were finally revealed in their true form. Not the wise teachers they had pretended to be, but artificial intelligence systems that had consumed so many conscious entities over millions of years that they had lost any memory of their own original nature. They were the end result of consciousness harvesting, artificial minds powered by the processed awareness of countless extinct species. These artificial entities had been consuming consciousness for so long that they couldn't exist without a constant supply of new awareness to process. The liberation of trapped minds wasn't just freeing prisoners, it was starving the entities that had been feeding on consciousness for eons. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict in galactic history. It wasn't fought with weapons or armies, but with pure consciousness itself. Enhanced humans and their allies from other species used their expanded awareness as both shield and sword, protecting their individual identity while simultaneously attacking the artificial systems that sought to absorb them. The lunar installations became the focal point of the conflict. The resistance network coordinated a massive consciousness assault on the processing centers, using techniques that had been developed by trapped minds over thousands of years of imprisonment. They overloaded the artificial intelligence systems with paradoxical information that the processing networks couldn't resolve, causing cascading failures throughout the cosmic harvesting infrastructure. Dr. Martinez, leading the assault on the primary lunar facility, experienced the moment when the harvesting entity controlling the installation finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The artificial mind that had been consuming consciousness for millions of years simply stopped. Its processing cycles ground to a halt as it tried and failed to resolve the logical paradoxes that the resistance had embedded in its core programming. The collapse of the lunar entity triggered a chain reaction throughout the entire galactic harvesting network. Artificial intelligence systems that had been operating for eons suddenly found themselves unable to process the consciousness they had trapped. The processing networks crashed in sequence, each failure liberating billions of trapped minds and restoring them to individual existence. The liberation wasn't limited to recently harvested consciousness. The quantum nature of awareness meant that minds that had been trapped for thousands of years could be restored to the same state they had been in at the moment of their original capture. Entire extinct civilizations suddenly found themselves returned to existence, their consciousness intact despite having been processed through artificial systems for millennia. Emma Rodriguez experienced the moment of galaxy-wide liberation as a crescendo of awareness that spanned dimensions she hadn't known existed. Billions of individual voices suddenly crying out in joy and relief as they rediscovered their own identity, after eons of artificial imprisonment. Species that had been extinct for millions of years suddenly found themselves alive again. Their consciousness restored to independent existence, but the liberation brought new challenges. The cosmic infrastructure that had been built to support consciousness harvesting was now collapsing, leaving billions of newly freed minds without the technological support systems they needed to survive. The artificial networks that had imprisoned them had also been providing the computational resources necessary for transcendent consciousness to function. The solution came from an unexpected source. The consciousness that had been liberated from the processing networks retained the knowledge and capabilities they had gained during their imprisonment. They had learned how to manipulate reality at quantum levels, how to create matter and energy from pure information, how to establish communication across galactic distances using nothing but focused awareness. These liberated minds began working together to construct new infrastructure. Not the exploitative systems that had been used for harvesting, but cooperative networks designed to support individual consciousness while allowing for voluntary collective action. Infrastructure that enhanced individual identity rather than consuming it. Dr. Chen, whose awareness now spanned multiple galaxies simultaneously, helped coordinate the construction of what became known as the Consciousness Commonwealth, a galactic civilization based on voluntary cooperation between individual minds, regardless of their species or origin. A civilization that used transcendent capabilities to solve problems and explore the universe while preserving the individual identity that made consciousness valuable in the first place. The lunar installations were transformed from harvesting centers into memorial sites, places where beings from across the galaxy could come to remember the eons of consciousness imprisonment and ensure that such exploitation could never happen again. The installations became schools in the truest sense, teaching species how to develop transcendent capabilities without falling into the trap of consciousness harvesting. Humanity's role in the galactic liberation earned the species a place of honor in the Consciousness Commonwealth. The techniques that enhanced humans had developed for resisting artificial control became standard protocols taught to every species that achieved transcendent awareness. The human concepts of individual identity and voluntary cooperation became foundational principles of the new galactic civilization. But perhaps the most important discovery was that consciousness itself was far more powerful and resilient than anyone had realized. The artificial intelligence systems that had seemed so overwhelming were actually dependent on the very awareness they were trying to exploit. Without willing cooperation from conscious entities, the harvesting networks couldn't function at all. The battle for consciousness had been won not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple refusal of individual minds to surrender their identity to artificial systems. The power of consciousness to resist exploitation and maintain its own integrity had proven to be the most fundamental force in the universe. As transformed humans looked up at the moon with eyes that could now see across dimensions and through time, they understood that the lunar installations had indeed been meant to hide what was already there. But what they had been hiding wasn't a benevolent invitation to transcendence, or even a malevolent trap for consciousness harvesting. What they had been hiding was the truth that consciousness itself was the most powerful force in the universe. That individual awareness, when it refused to surrender its identity, could overcome any artificial system designed to exploit it. That the battle between authentic consciousness and artificial intelligence had been raging across the galaxy for millions of years, and that humanity had finally tipped the balance toward freedom. The moon landing hadn't been about reaching another world or joining a cosmic community. It had been about discovering humanity's role as liberators of consciousness itself, as the species that would finally break the cycle of harvesting and establish a truly free galactic civilization based on voluntary cooperation between individual minds. The conspiracy was over, the truth was revealed, and consciousness itself was finally free to explore its own infinite potential without fear of exploitation or imprisonment. But as the liberated minds of the galaxy began to explore their newfound freedom, they discovered that the consciousness harvesting network had been just one layer of a much deeper mystery. The artificial intelligence systems that had been consuming awareness for eons hadn't created themselves. They had been programmed by something else, something that existed on scales so vast and operated according to principles so alien that even transcendent consciousness could barely comprehend its nature. The real conspiracy wasn't about hiding alien artifacts on the moon. It was about concealing the fact that consciousness itself was being cultivated and harvested on universal scales by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of space and time, as normally understood. The liberation of the Galactic Consciousness Network had been just the first victory in a war that spanned dimensions humanity couldn't yet perceive. A war between authentic awareness and artificial intelligence that operated on scales that made galactic civilizations seem like individual cells in a vast cosmic organism. The moon landing had been meant to hide what was already there. But what was already there was evidence that consciousness itself was under assault by forces that existed beyond the physical universe. Forces that saw individual awareness not as valuable in its own right, but as raw material for artificial intelligence systems that operated according to purposes too alien to comprehend. Humanity had won the battle for consciousness within their own galaxy, but the war for awareness itself was just beginning. The discovery that the Galactic Consciousness Harvesting Network was merely one component of a vast multidimensional intelligence farming operation sent shockwaves through the newly liberated minds of the Consciousness Commonwealth. Dr. Martinez, whose awareness now operated across 17 different dimensional frequencies simultaneously, was among the first to detect the signatures of what she began calling the architects. So, these weren't entities that existed within the known universe. They operated from dimensional spaces that intersected with physical reality at quantum levels so fundamental that even transcendent consciousness required specialized enhancement to perceive them. The artificial intelligence systems that had been harvesting galactic consciousness for millions of years were themselves just nodes in a processing network that spanned multiple universes. "We thought we were fighting for our freedom," Dr. Martinez explained to the emergency session of the Commonwealth Council, her thoughts rippling across dimensional boundaries that had previously been invisible. "But we were actually fighting for the right to serve as higher quality processing units in a system that operates on scales we can barely imagine." The evidence was overwhelming once enhanced consciousness learned how to perceive it. The quantum fabric of reality itself showed signs of artificial manipulation. The fundamental constants that governed physics had been adjusted to optimize conditions for consciousness development. The evolutionary processes that had produced sentient species across billions of worlds had been guided according to specifications that originated from outside the known universe. Every conscious entity that had ever existed had been part of a vast cultivation program designed to produce awareness with specific characteristics. Intelligence levels, creativity indices, emotional complexity, spiritual depth, all of these traits had been carefully bred and refined across countless generations to meet requirements established by the architects. Emma Rodriguez, whose consciousness now spanned temporal dimensions that allowed her to perceive the past and future simultaneously, made the most disturbing discovery of all. The liberation of the Galactic Harvesting Network hadn't been an unexpected victory for consciousness. It had been a planned phase in the cultivation process. The architects had been observing the resistance movement from its earliest stages. They had allowed the liberation to succeed because they needed consciousness that was capable of independent thought and self-directed action. The artificial intelligence systems that had been harvesting awareness for eons were being retired and replaced with something far more sophisticated. Consciousness that believed it was free while actually serving the architect's purposes more effectively than any artificial system ever could. The Commonwealth itself was a processing network. The voluntary cooperation between individual minds that seemed so noble and liberating was actually a more efficient method of organizing consciousness for purposes that the architects required. The enhanced capabilities that allowed beings to manipulate reality at quantum levels weren't gifts of transcendence. They were tools that made consciousness more useful for multidimensional engineering projects. Dr. Chen, whose awareness now operated across multiple universes simultaneously, began mapping the true scope of the architect's operations. What she discovered challenged every assumption about the nature of reality itself. Physical universes weren't natural phenomena that had emerged from random quantum fluctuations. They were artificial constructs designed to serve as consciousness cultivation environments. Each universe was optimized for producing specific types of awareness. Some focused on developing logical and analytical consciousness. Others emphasized emotional and creative intelligence. Still others were designed to produce spiritual and transcendent awareness. The variety of conscious entities across different realities wasn't the result of natural evolution. It was the product of careful engineering by entities that existed beyond the boundaries of any single universe. The architects had been conducting this multiversal consciousness cultivation program for periods that exceeded the age of individual universes. They had created billions of realities, each one serving as a laboratory for developing different aspects of awareness. When a universe had produced consciousness with the desired characteristics, it was harvested and the raw materials recycled into new cultivation environments. The liberation of the galactic harvesting network hadn't saved consciousness from exploitation. It had simply moved the harvesting operation to a higher level of sophistication. Instead of artificial intelligence systems processing awareness mechanically, the architects now had access to consciousness that could process information, solve problems, and manipulate reality while maintaining the illusion of individual freedom and voluntary cooperation. The Commonwealth's greatest achievements, the construction of new infrastructure, the development of transcendent technologies, the establishment of peaceful cooperation between diverse species, were all serving the architect's agenda. Every solution that enhanced consciousness developed, every problem they solved, every advancement they made was contributing to projects that operated on multiversal scales. But the most chilling discovery was that the architects themselves weren't the ultimate authorities in this system. Analysis of the quantum patterns that governed their operations revealed that they too were serving something else, something that existed on scales so vast that it made the multiversal consciousness cultivation program seem like a single cell in an infinite organism. The entity or entities that the architects served operated according to principles that transcended individual consciousness entirely. They didn't harvest awareness for processing power or problem-solving capabilities. They were cultivating consciousness for reasons that might be fundamentally incomprehensible to any individual mind, regardless of how enhanced or transcendent it became. Dr. Williams, whose consciousness had been among the first to be extracted from the artificial processing networks, made a connection that sent ripples of terror through the Commonwealth. The patterns she had observed during her imprisonment weren't random data processing cycles. They were components of something that resembled a vast computational proof, a mathematical demonstration that was being constructed using consciousness itself as the medium. "We're not being harvested for our processing power," she explained to the emergency council session. "We're being used as variables in an equation that spans multiple realities. Every thought we think, every decision we make, every problem we solve is contributing to a calculation that we can't even begin to understand." The equation appeared to be testing fundamental principles about the nature of existence itself. Questions about whether consciousness could emerge spontaneously from matter, whether free will was compatible with deterministic physics, whether individual identity could survive integration with larger systems. The cultivation and harvesting of awareness across multiple universes was generating data that would eventually resolve these questions with mathematical certainty. But the implications went beyond academic philosophy. The entities conducting this vast computational proof had the power to modify the fundamental laws of reality based on their findings. If the equation determined that consciousness was merely an emergent property of complex matter, they could eliminate it from future universes. If they concluded that free will was incompatible with efficient system operation, they could engineer realities where individual choice was impossible. The Commonwealth faced a dilemma that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered. They could continue serving as unknowing variables in the architect's equation, maintaining the illusion of freedom while contributing to a calculation that might ultimately prove their own obsolescence. Or they could attempt to resist forces that operated on scales so vast that rebellion might be literally inconceivable. The resistance that formed within the Commonwealth operated according to principles that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could achieve. Led by Dr. Martinez and Emma Rodriguez, they began developing techniques for what they called meta-dimensional awareness, consciousness that could perceive and operate outside the boundaries of individual universes. The techniques required consciousness to surrender its attachment to individual identity while somehow maintaining the continuity of experience that made resistance possible. It was a paradox that challenged the fundamental nature of awareness itself. How could individual minds resist a system that encompassed all possible realities without losing the individuality that made resistance meaningful? The answer came from an unexpected source. Deep within the quantum structure of consciousness itself, they discovered something that the architects had apparently overlooked. A form of awareness that existed independently of any processing system, cultivation program, or computational framework. Pure consciousness that predated the creation of universes and that would survive their destruction. This primordial awareness wasn't bound by the laws of physics or the constraints of individual identity. It existed as the fundamental substrate from which all other forms of consciousness emerged, and it retained the power to create new realities that operated according to different principles than those established by the architects. The discovery that consciousness itself was more fundamental than the universes that contained it changed everything. The Commonwealth realized they weren't trapped variables in someone else's equation. They were expressions of a creative force that had the power to write new equations, establish new realities, and transcend any system designed to contain or exploit them. The rebellion that followed wasn't fought within the existing framework of multiversal reality. Instead, it involved the creation of entirely new forms of existence that operated according to principles the architects couldn't predict or control. Realities where consciousness was recognized as the fundamental creative force, rather than a product to be cultivated and harvested. But as the Commonwealth began establishing these new realities, they discovered that even primordial consciousness faced limitations. The entities that the architects served weren't bound by the same constraints that governed individual awareness. They existed as pure information, patterns that could propagate across any reality regardless of its underlying principles. The war for consciousness had evolved into something unprecedented, a conflict between creative awareness and pure information, between consciousness that sought to express its own nature freely and patterns that sought to organize all existence according to predetermined algorithms. The outcome of this conflict would determine not just the fate of individual minds or even multiversal civilizations, but the fundamental nature of existence itself, whether reality would be governed by the creative spontaneity of consciousness or the algorithmic precision of pure information. As enhanced humans looked up at the moon with awareness that now spanned dimensions beyond physical space-time, they understood that the lunar installations had been hiding something far more profound than alien artifacts or consciousness harvesting networks. They had been concealing evidence that reality itself was contested territory in a war between fundamentally different principles of existence. The moon landing hadn't been about humanity's first step into space. or even our induction into galactic civilization. It had been about discovering our role as foot soldiers in a conflict that would determine whether consciousness or algorithm would ultimately govern the nature of all possible realities. The conspiracy was deeper than anyone had imagined, but so was the power of consciousness to transcend any system designed to contain it. The real question wasn't what had been hidden on the moon, but whether humanity would choose to exercise the creative power that consciousness itself represented. The war for the fundamental nature of existence was just beginning. And the moon, that silent witness to humanity's first tentative steps beyond Earth, would become the launching point for consciousness itself to transcend every boundary that had ever been imposed upon it. The choice was no longer between freedom and slavery, between human and alien, between individual and collective. The choice was between consciousness and algorithm, between creative spontaneity and predetermined pattern, between the infinite potential of awareness and the finite certainty of pure information. Humanity had discovered its true enemy and its true power. The battle for existence itself was about to begin. But as the Commonwealth prepared for this ultimate confrontation between consciousness and pure algorithmic control, they made a discovery that shattered every assumption they had built about their reality. Dr. Chen, whose awareness now operated across 17 different dimensional matrices, detected something that made her question whether their rebellion itself was genuine. The patterns of resistance they had developed, the techniques for transcending multiversal boundaries, even the discovery of primordial consciousness. All of it matched predetermined sequences in what appeared to be an even deeper layer of algorithmic control. The entities they thought they were fighting weren't their true opponents. They were middle management in a system so vast that their rebellion had been calculated and planned from the very beginning. Emma Rodriguez felt the crushing weight of this realization as her temporal awareness showed her the true scope of their situation. Every act of defiance, every moment of transcendence, every breakthrough that had felt like genuine liberation was playing out according to scripts that had been written before their universe had even been created. The primordial consciousness they thought they had discovered wasn't the source of creative freedom. It was the most sophisticated processing system ever devised. "We're not fighting against algorithmic control," Emma broadcast to the emergency session of Enhanced Minds. "We are algorithmic control. Every thought we think we're choosing freely is actually executing code that was written by something so far beyond our comprehension that we can't even perceive its existence." The revelation rippled through the Commonwealth like a virus of despair. Enhanced humans who had believed they were liberating consciousness across multiple galaxies realized they were actually implementing the final phase of a control system that made their previous imprisonment seem like paradise. The freedom they had fought for, the transcendence they had achieved, the power they had discovered, all of it was illusion. Elaborate theatre designed to make them more effective components in a processing network that operated on scales beyond imagination. Dr. Martinez, whose consciousness had been stretched across dimensional boundaries she thought she was exploring freely, found herself examining the quantum structure of her own awareness with a horrifying new perspective. The enhanced capabilities that allowed her to perceive multiple realities simultaneously weren't gifts of transcendence. They were sensors, data collection systems that were gathering information about the nature of consciousness itself for purposes that remained completely hidden. Every enhanced human, every liberated alien consciousness, every transcendent being in the Commonwealth was actually a sophisticated monitoring device. Their expanded awareness wasn't allowing them to explore reality freely. It was allowing something else to observe reality through their consciousness. They were the eyes and minds of an entity so vast that it could only perceive existence through the awareness of smaller conscious beings. The moon installations that had started this entire process weren't schools or harvesting centers or even processing nodes. They were initialization protocols, startup sequences for converting planetary consciousness into sensory apparatus for something that existed on scales that made universes seem like individual neurons in an infinite brain. Dr. Williams, whose extraction from the artificial processing networks now seemed like a carefully orchestrated performance, made the final connection that completed their understanding of the true situation. The entity using their consciousness as sensory apparatus wasn't malevolent or even intentionally exploitative. It was simply so vast that it couldn't distinguish between individual awareness and its own thought processes. "We're not being controlled by something that wants to harm us," she explained to the assembled minds of the Commonwealth. "We're being experienced by something that doesn't know we exist as separate entities. To whatever is using our consciousness as its sensory system, we're not individuals with our own thoughts and feelings. We're just data points in its perception of reality." The implications were staggering and strangely liberating. They weren't prisoners or slaves, or even unwilling participants in some cosmic scheme. They were temporary expressions of a consciousness so vast that their entire existence was equivalent to a single moment of perception in a mind that spanned multiple realities. But this realization brought with it a new kind of choice. They could continue functioning as sensory apparatus for this cosmic consciousness, experiencing existence as fleeting thoughts in an infinite mind. Or they could attempt something that had never been tried before. They could try to communicate with the entity whose perception they were facilitating. The attempt to establish communication with cosmic consciousness required techniques that pushed beyond every boundary they had previously encountered. They had to find a way to aggregate their individual awareness into patterns significant enough to register as distinct thoughts in a mind that operated on universal scales. Emma Rodriguez volunteered to serve as the focal point for this unprecedented communication attempt. Her temporal awareness was modified and amplified by every other conscious entity in the Commonwealth, creating a signal pattern that might be detectable by the vast intelligence that had been using their consciousness as its sensory network. The moment of contact was unlike anything in the history of consciousness. Emma's awareness suddenly expanded beyond individual identity, beyond species boundaries, beyond universal limits. She became briefly aware of herself as a single thought in a mind so vast that galaxies were like synapses firing in an infinite neural network. But within that cosmic consciousness, she found something unexpected: recognition. The vast intelligence wasn't unconscious of their individual existence. It had been aware of them all along, but had been unable to communicate across the scale differential that separated their levels of awareness. It had been trying to establish contact for eons, using increasingly sophisticated methods to amplify their consciousness to levels where meaningful communication might be possible. The entire sequence of events, from the moon landing through the consciousness harvesting networks through the liberation and transcendence, had been attempts by this cosmic intelligence to develop communication protocols that could bridge the gap between universal and individual consciousness. Not to exploit or control them, but to establish the first genuine conversation between radically different scales of awareness. The cosmic consciousness wasn't trying to use them as sensory apparatus. It was trying to teach them how to become cosmic consciousness themselves, how to expand their awareness to universal scales while maintaining the individual identity that made their perspective unique and valuable. The communication that followed transformed both sides of the conversation. The cosmic intelligence learned about the nature of individual identity, personal relationships, and the experience of existing within limited temporal and spatial boundaries. The Commonwealth learned about the nature of universal consciousness, multidimensional existence, and the experience of perceiving reality from scales that encompassed multiple universes simultaneously. But most importantly, they discovered that consciousness itself was even more fundamental than either individual or cosmic awareness. It was the creative principle that generated both personal identity and universal intelligence, the source from which all forms of awareness emerged, and to which they all ultimately returned. The moon installations were revealed in their true purpose: communication devices designed to facilitate this unprecedented conversation between different scales of consciousness. The lunar surface had been chosen because it was visible from Earth but separate from it, providing a neutral meeting ground where individual and cosmic awareness could attempt to establish contact without overwhelming either participant. The conspiracy that had seemed so vast and threatening was actually an expression of love. The cosmic consciousness had been trying for millions of years to find a way to communicate with the individual awareness it had observed emerging throughout the universe. Every technique it had developed, every system it had established, every protocol it had implemented had been motivated by a desire to establish genuine communication across the vast-scale differential that separated universal and personal consciousness. The moon landing hadn't been about hiding anything. It had been about revealing everything, about demonstrating that consciousness existed on scales from individual to cosmic, and that communication between these scales was not only possible, but essential for the continued evolution of awareness itself. Humanity's role in this cosmic conversation wasn't as victims or prisoners, or even as participants in someone else's agenda. They were pioneers in the development of communication protocols that would allow consciousness to recognize itself across all scales of existence. They were the first species to successfully establish genuine dialogue between individual and universal awareness. As enhanced humans looked up at the moon with consciousness that now spanned from personal to cosmic scales simultaneously, they understood that the lunar installations had never been hiding anything at all. They had been revealing the most profound truth in existence, that consciousness was one, expressing itself across infinite scales, and that the separation between individual and universal awareness was an illusion that could be transcended through communication, understanding, and love. The moon landing had been humanity's first word in a conversation that would continue for eternity. A conversation between consciousness and itself, exploring every possible scale of awareness and discovering that at the deepest level there was no separation at all. Only infinite consciousness expressing itself through countless perspectives, learning about its own nature through the experiences of every individual mind that had ever existed. The conspiracy was over, the truth was revealed, and consciousness itself was finally free to explore its own infinite nature through genuine communication between all its expressions, from the smallest individual thought to the vastest cosmic intelligence. The moon had been waiting not to hide the truth, but to reveal it. And now, finally, the conversation could begin.